She baked in the dark, so no one would have to look at her. Every night, while the town of Mill Haven slept behind drawn curtains and locked doors, Clara June Whitlock hauled 50-pound sacks of flour across a cold kitchen floor and turned her grief into something golden. She was 29 years old, buried in debt, abandoned by the only people who were supposed to love her and utterly alone. Then one moonless night, a stranger stepped out of the shadows, not to mock her, not to pity her, but to offer her something she had never once been given in her entire life. A choice. Stay and keep breaking, or walk into the unknown and finally begin to live. This is the story of what happens when two broken people stop running and decide to build something real. The town of Mill Haven, nestled at the edge of the Ohio flatlands, was the kind of place that remembered everything and forgave nothing. It had a single main street lined with white-painted storefronts, a church with a proud copper steeple gone green with age, and a population of just over 1,100 people who had known each other's business for 3 generations, running. In summer, the cornfields stretched golden all the way to the horizon. In winter, the wind came down off the plains like a judgment. It was by any measure a beautiful place to live, and for Clara June Whitlock it had been something very close to a prison. She had been born in the old Whitlock house on the corner of Sycamore and 5th, the only child of Harold and Vivian Whitlock. Harold was a quiet, soft-spoken man who worked at the county assessor's office and spent his evenings in his garden coaxing tomatoes out of stubborn clay soil. He was gentle in the way that water is gentle, wearing things down, slowly, never raising his voice, never quite finding the courage to stand between his daughter and the storm that wore his wife's face. Vivian Whitlock was another matter entirely. She was a handsome woman in the way that a carved marble statue is handsome, beautiful to look at, and utterly cold to the touch. She had cheekbones that could cut glass and a sense of social propriety so rigid that it functioned less like manners and more like a weapon. What Vivian wanted from life was very simple and very cruel. She wanted to be admired. She wanted a daughter who looked like a porcelain figurine and moved through Mill Haven's social circles like a showpiece. What she got was Clara. Clara had been a large baby, a large child, and grew into a large young woman. She was sturdily built from the very beginning, with broad, capable shoulders, strong hands, and a frame that suggested the kind of physical resilience that comes from generations of farm stock somewhere far back in the bloodline. She had her father's kind, dark eyes and her grandmother Mabel's thick chestnut hair, and if anyone in Mill Haven had ever truly looked at her, they might have seen something worth looking at. But Vivian looked at her daughter every single day of Clara's life and made absolutely certain that Clara knew in precise and specific terms exactly what her mother saw instead. It began with small things the way cruelty usually does. A sigh when Clara sat down to breakfast. A tightening around the mouth when Clara came downstairs dressed for school. By the time Clara was 12, the sighs had become commentary. By the time she was 15, the commentary had become a daily ritual of dissection, so thorough and so practiced that it had taken on the quality of a catechism. Vivian never screamed. She never needed to. Her voice stayed perfectly level, perfectly pleasant, while the words themselves stripped the plaster from the walls. You really shouldn't wear that color, Clara. It doesn't do you any favors. I've told you before, the way you carry yourself makes people uncomfortable. Try to take up less space. I ran into Margaret Ellis at the drugstore today. Her daughter just won the junior beauty pageant. She asked about you. I didn't know what to say. She always knew what to say. That was the most devastating part. Vivian Whitlock had a gift for finding the exact nerve, the exact soft and unguarded place, and pressing on it with the calm, methodical precision of a dentist probing for rot. And because she never raised her voice, because she always followed the cruelest observations with a quiet, I'm only telling you this because I love you and someone has to. Clara spent years believing it, believing that her mother was simply being honest, believing that the world outside the Whitlock house agreed with every single word. Harold watched all of it happen. Clara knew in the oldest and saddest part of herself that her father was not a wicked man. He loved her in the helpless, aching way of someone who can see a fire burning but cannot bring himself to throw his body in front of it. He made her hot cocoa on winter mornings. He left library books on her pillow. He squeezed her shoulder in the hallway when Vivian had been particularly cutting a squeeze that said, "I know I'm sorry, I love you," and also at the same time, "Please don't ask me to do anything about it." Clara forgave him for it again and again because she understood that kind of helplessness better than she understood almost anything else in the world. What saved her in those years was the kitchen, and more specifically, what saved her was her grandmother Mabel. Mabel Whitlock Harold's mother had died when Clara was 8 years old, but she had left behind something irreplaceable. Tucked into the back of a hall closet, wrapped in a flour sack dish towel and bound with kitchen twine, was a collection of handwritten recipe books, their pages soft with age and spotted with old vanilla and butter stains, the margins filled with cramped notes in Mabel's looping, enthusiastic hand. Try more brown sugar. This one better with lard than with butter. Make double, because people always want more than they say they do. Clara had discovered those books at the age of 9, crouched in the hall closet with a flashlight, while her parents argued somewhere in the back of the house, and she had felt for the first time in her conscious life something warm and steady settle in her chest. She read every page. She memorized the recipes the way other children memorized multiplication tables. And then, slowly, carefully terrified of making a mess and incurring her mother's perfectly level, perfectly devastating commentary, she began to bake. She found that she was gifted at it. Not in a showy way, not in the way that wins competitions or draws compliments, but in a deeper, quieter way. She had the kind of hands that understood dough, that knew instinctively when a crust needed more water, when a batter had been overworked, when a loaf needed another 10 minutes. She had patience and she had precision, and she had something else that no cookbook can teach: a genuine love for the process itself, for the way raw and separate ingredients surrendered to each other and became something entirely new. For years, it was simply her private joy. Vivian did not particularly object to Clara baking, since the results appeared on the dinner table, and could be offered to guests and admired, provided Vivian positioned herself as the one who had supervised the effort. Clara learned very early not to correct that impression. It was a small price to pay for being allowed to keep the one thing that felt entirely her own. She never went to college. Vivian had floated the idea of secretarial school once, then dropped it with a dismissive remark about tuition and practicality that Clara understood to mean something else entirely. She got a part-time position at the dry goods store on Main Street, where she worked the back inventory room and rarely had to interact with customers, which suited her perfectly. She came home in the evenings, helped with dinner, and when the house had gone quiet and dark, she baked. She baked through her 20s. She baked through the small accumulated grief of watching other women her age marry and move into houses of their own. She baked through the years of Vivian's commentary and Harold's gentle, helpless squeezes and Millhaven's particular brand of small-town social arithmetic that had long since assigned her to the category of invisible. Then Harold got sick. It happened faster than anyone expected. He had been slowing down for a year or more, moving through his garden a little more carefully, sitting down to rest in the middle of tasks that had never tired him before. By the time the diagnosis came, the illness had already been at work for a long time. He spent his last winter in the hospital bed that the county medical service brought to the house, set up in the front parlor, so he could see the garden through the window. Clara sat with him every evening. She brought him things from her baking, soft things rolls and custards and shortbread cookies, because he had trouble swallowing, and he would hold her hand and look at her with those kind, sorry eyes, and sometimes he would say her name, just her name, in a way that contained everything he had never managed to say out loud. He died on a Thursday morning in March, with snow falling outside the parlor window and Clara's hand in his. Vivian was in the kitchen making phone calls. Clara had believed in the numb and exhausted way of someone who has just watched their only protector leave the world that grief would be the worst of what came next. She was wrong. What came next was worse than grief, because grief is at least honest. What Vivian did was something else. Within 3 weeks of Harold's funeral, the truth of the household's finances had come fully into the light. Harold had been a careful man, but a modest earner, and the years of his illness had cost more than the family's small savings could absorb. There was debt. Not ruinous debt, not the kind that makes the newspapers, but the grinding, stubborn kind that sits on a person's chest at night and makes breathing difficult. The mortgage on the Sycamore Street house was behind by 4 months. The medical bills were a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter that Clara could not bring herself to open all at once. Vivian, it turned out, had been making other plans. His name was Gerald Ashby, and he had a ranch property 2 counties over and a silver belt buckle, and a great deal of money that he was willing to spend on a woman like Vivian Whitlock if the circumstances were right. The circumstances apparently became right approximately 6 days after Harold Whitlock was in the ground. Clara found out about him the way she found out about most things in that house, not because anyone told her, but because she was in the right place at the right time and had learned over the years to listen very carefully to the silences between words. The morning Vivian left, it was raining. She came downstairs with 2 large leather suitcases and set them by the front door with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had been packing for some time. She was dressed for travel, her hair perfect, her expression carrying that familiar quality of pleasant flatness that meant she had already decided something, and the deciding was all that mattered. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and she looked at her mother and at the suitcases, and she understood everything in a single perfectly silent moment. "I cannot stay in this house," Vivian said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than unkindness. "It would destroy me. Gerald has offered me a way forward, and I intend to take it." "The mortgage," Clara said. The dish towel was very still in her hands. "The house will need to be dealt with," Vivian agreed. "I've left the paperwork on the desk in the study. You're a resourceful girl, Clara. You'll manage." She picked up her handbag. She paused at the door, and for one moment, one single unguarded moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker across her mother's perfectly composed face. Regret, or something related to regret. Then it was gone. "Try to eat a little less," Vivian said. "Without me here it's easy to let things go." And she walked out the door and into Gerald Ashby's waiting car and drove away, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway with the dish towel in her hands and the rain falling outside the window, and 4 months of unpaid mortgage sitting on her father's desk in the study, and she did not cry. She was not sure why. She had the feeling that the crying would come later, and that it would be very bad when it did, and that she would manage it alone, which was simply the truth of her situation. She did not sell the house, not right away. She could not afford to think that far ahead yet. She took on more hours at the dry goods store. She responded to the medical bills one at a time, arranging payment plans with a polite persistence that surprised the billing offices. She ate very little and spent very carefully, and she baked as she always had in the dead of night when the town was sleeping and no one could see her through the windows. It was Gus Peterson, the owner of Peterson's General Goods on the edge of Millhaven's main commercial district, who first gave her the idea. Gus was a large, rumpled man with a white beard and the temperament of a bear who has decided on balance to be kind to people. He had known Clara since she was a child, had always had a quiet regard for her that asked nothing in return, And one evening when she came in to pick up a bag of bread flour, he had tilted his big head to one side and said, "You know, Clara, I've been selling day-old muffins from Hendrick's Bakery at the front counter for years. People buy them, but I'll tell you honestly, they buy them the way people buy things when there's nothing better. You ever think about selling some of what you make?" She had stared at him. The idea was so foreign to her that it took a moment to even process it as a real question. "I'm not a professional baker," she said. "Neither was whoever's making those muffins," Gus said simply. "But yours would be better. I've tasted your bread, Clara. The whole church hall tasted your bread at your father's reception, even if they didn't know who made it. There wasn't a crumb left." She had gone home and lain awake most of that night, the idea working in her like something yeasty and alive. The money would help. That much was undeniable. But it was more than the money, and she knew it, and the knowing was terrifying. Because to sell her baking was to step even a fraction of an inch out from behind the wall she had built around herself, and the wall was the only reason she was still standing. She made a compromise with herself. She would bake at night as she always had, and she would deliver to Gus before dawn through the back door of the shop, and Gus would sell the goods and settle accounts with her once a week, quietly in cash, and no one needed to see her, and no one needed to know, and she could go on being invisible while still finding some way to keep from drowning. Gus agreed without hesitation in the way of a man who understands that some arrangements are fragile and must be handled gently. So the nights in the Whitlock kitchen became something with purpose. She baked sourdough loaves with a crust that shattered at the first touch and an interior so soft it was almost a mercy. She baked cinnamon rolls so fragrant they could be smelled from 2 storefronts away, and Gus told her the first time he put them out, they sold in 40 minutes. She baked chess pies and apple butter tarts and the dense, dark gingerbread from Mabel's recipe book, with the note in the margin that said, "Always add a little black pepper. Trust me on this," and she did trust her, and it was magnificent. She baked alone and in silence and in the dark, and it was the closest thing to peace she had ever known, and she told herself it was enough. She told herself that for 9 months. Then the bank sent a final notice regarding the mortgage, and she did the mathematics, and she understood that it was not enough, and would not be enough, not without something changing, and she could not see what that something might be. That was the weight she would have carrying on the night that everything changed. Not just the financial weight, though, that was real and pressing and kept her awake until the small hours. The deeper weight, the one she had carried since childhood, the one that had shaped her posture and her habits and her entire relationship with the world, the belief, cellular bone deep, carved into her by years of soft and relentless instruction that she was something to be hidden, that her body was an embarrassment, that her presence was an imposition, that the greatest kindness she could offer the world was to make herself as small and as invisible as possible, and to make sure that the only thing she sent out into it was something useful, something good, something that justified the space she could not stop taking up. She was hauling a second sack of bread flour through the back alley behind Peterson's General Goods at 2:15 in the morning when the stranger stepped out of the shadows and her entire life turned. Part 2. A Midnight Pact. She heard him before she saw him. A single footstep on the packed dirt of the alley, unhurried but deliberate, the step of someone who had been standing still and decided to move. Clara stopped. The flour sack was balanced across her broad shoulders, her hands gripping the rough burlap, her breath coming in small clouds in the October cold. Every instinct she possessed went very quiet and very alert. "I'll take that," said a voice. It was a low voice, not a gentle one, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without having to raise it. It carried no particular warmth, but it carried something else, something straightforward and unadorned that struck her in the fraction of a second before fear could organize itself properly as oddly honest. "I beg your pardon," Clara said. He stepped into the thin light that fell from the back window of Gus's shop, and she saw him. He was tall, north of 6 feet, with the kind of lean, weathered build that comes from years of physical work rather than anything deliberate. His coat was well made, but plain dark wool, no ornamentation. He had a square jaw, carrying several days of beard. Dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of the Ohio River in late autumn. He was somewhere in his late 30s or possibly older. It was difficult to say. The outdoors had done things to his face that made the usual calculations unreliable. He was looking at the flour sack on her shoulders with the direct practical gaze of someone assessing a situation rather than judging a person. "The sack," he said. "It's at least 50 pounds. I'll carry it in for you." "I've been carrying it myself," Clara said. She did not move. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile, not exactly, but a small acknowledgement of something. "I can see that," he said. "I'm not suggesting you can't. I'm suggesting I'm standing here doing nothing, and there's a door right there, and it seems like a waste." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had grown up in a town where every conversation was a social transaction and every gesture had an audience, and she had learned to read the angles. This man had no angle that she could detect. He was simply there, stating a fact, making an offer. She stepped to the side and let him take the sack. He carried it easily, ducking through the back door of Gus's shop and setting it precisely where she had been setting flour sacks for the past 9 months, against the left wall beside the shelving unit. He looked at the neatly stacked boxes of pastries already on the back counter, the careful labels in Clara's handwriting, and he did not comment on them, which she noted. "Tom Brannigan," he said, straightening up. He did not offer his hand. He simply said the name as if supplying a piece of practical information. "Clara Whitlock," she said. He nodded once as if filing it away. They stood in the back room of Gus Peterson's store in the middle of the night, 2 strangers in the lamplight, and then he said, "You're the one who's been baking these?" And it was not a question. "Yes." "Gus told me. I've been renting the Dillard barn out on Route 9 for the past 2 weeks. I came in for supplies on a Wednesday, and he'd just put out a tray of something with apple butter. I bought 4 of them." He paused. "I've never bought 4 of anything." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Silence, she had long ago discovered, was frequently the safest response. "I was going to ask Gus to find out who made them," Tom said. "And then I was standing in the alley tonight, and I saw you hauling that sack, and I thought that's probably her." He looked at her steadily, not with any particular expression she could identify, not the look she was accustomed to receiving, the look that moved over her and then away, the look that dismissed or pitied or simply recorded and filed her in the category of persons best left unaddressed. He looked at her the way he had looked at the flour sack, with a kind of straightforward attention that had nothing in it that she needed to defend herself against. "What are you doing out here at 2 a.m, she asked. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Usually can't." He let that sit for a moment. "And there are things I need to work through. Oh, I find walking helps." She found out in the conversation that followed that Thomas Hale Brannigan was from Lancer County, 3 counties east, where his family had farmed the same stretch of bottomland for 4 generations. Rich land, he said, without pride or sentiment, just accuracy. River-bottom soil that could grow anything. His father had left it jointly to Tom and his younger brother Daniel, with the provision that they work it together. Daniel, as it turned out, had his own ideas about what working together looked like. Over the course of 2 years, through a sequence of legal maneuvers that Tom described with the clipped, controlled precision of a man who has gone over the story too many times in his own head and stripped all the emotion out of it to keep from burning, Daniel had leveraged a series of loans, transferred deeds, and eventually sold the entire property to an agribusiness consortium from Columbus for a sum that had been divided cleanly and legally and completely, without Tom's knowledge, into a portion that went to Daniel and a portion that went to the lawyers who had made the whole thing possible. Tom had come out of it with a settlement from the legal action. He subsequently pursued a settlement that was fair only in the sense that it was better than nothing, which is a very low bar for fair. He had used it to purchase a hardscrabble parcel of land in a place called Willow Bend Prairie, 2 counties west, because it was what he could afford, and because it was far enough away from Lancer County that he would not have to look at Daniel's face. Willow Bend Prairie, Clara said. She had heard of it. Everyone in that part of Ohio had heard of it. It was the kind of land that farming almanacs described in the careful language of understatement arid conditions, challenging terrain, limited water access language that translated in plain terms to mean that the land was hard and the wind was relentless, and every growing season was a negotiation between the farmer and the sky that the farmer was not guaranteed to win. "It's what I've got," Tom said simply. "What are you doing in Millhaven? Trying to figure out what I need to make a go of it before winter sets in hard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a bad roof and 4 walls and a wood stove that may or may not make it through January. I've got seed for spring if the ground cooperates. And I've got the kind of quiet that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose, which is less comforting than people seem to think it is." Clara understood that. She understood it in the specific, intimate way that you understand something only when you have lived inside it. She was not sure what made her say what she said next. It was not characteristic of her. Impulse was not something she allowed herself. And yet, "I understand that kind of quiet," she said. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted some small, careful adjustment. The expression of a person who has said a great many things to a great many people and has rarely felt that the saying was received, recognizing suddenly that it has been. They talked for another hour. She told him about the mortgage. She told him about Vivian. Not all of it, not the years of careful, systematic dismantling, but enough of it that he understood the shape of what had happened. She told him about the bakery arrangement with Gus, about the middle-of-the-night deliveries, about the way the numbers still did not add up, no matter how carefully she arranged them. He listened in the way that only certain people know how to listen without interrupting, without offering solutions, before she had finished, without the small performative expressions of sympathy that are more about the listener than the speaker. He simply received what she said and let it sit there, which was, she realized, one of the rarest things she had ever been given. At the end of the hour, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a proposition." She waited. "I need someone who can help me make that land into something livable before winter makes it impossible. Someone who knows how to work, really work, not the idea of it, but the actual physical reality of it." He glanced briefly at her hands, the calloused palms, the flour still caught in the creases. "You clearly know how to work, and you clearly know how to make something out of not very much." "I'm not a rancher," Clara said. "Neither am I technically yet. But I will be." He paused. "I can't offer much. I can pay your outstanding debts before the bank takes the house, because I've got enough of the settlement left for that, and it seems like a practical way to use it. In return, you help me get the property functional and keep the household running while I get the operation off the ground. You'll have your own space, your own room, your own hours. I'm not looking for anything beyond what I've described." Clara looked at him. "You're describing a business arrangement." "Yes." "You don't know me. I know you haul 50-pound flour sacks through a back alley alone at 2 in the morning because you're trying to hold your life together without asking anyone for help," he said. "That tells me more than most introductions." There was a long silence. The wood stove in the back room ticked. Outside, Millhaven slept its deep, oblivious sleep. Clara thought about the stack of envelopes on her father's desk. She thought about the bank's final notice, which she had read 4 times now and understood perfectly. She thought about Vivian walking out the door with her 2 leather suitcases, telling her to eat a little less, and then getting into a car and driving away from the 9 months of care that Clara had provided, without being asked and without being thanked. She thought about Mabel's recipe books wrapped in their flour sack dish towel. She thought about the kind of quiet that comes from having nothing left to lose, and whether it was possible that 2 people who had found themselves in that particular quiet might between them make something out of it. "I'm not leaving Millhaven to be someone's housekeeper," she said. "I'm not asking you to be," Tom said. "I'm asking you to be a partner in a practical arrangement. There's a difference." "If it doesn't work," she said, "if we can't manage it, then we cut it clean and figure out the next thing. I'm not in the business of keeping anyone somewhere they don't want to be." Clara thought about the cracked mirror upstairs in her old bedroom. The one her mother had left behind, the one Clara had stared into for so many years, practicing the particular art of seeing herself the way Vivian saw her. She thought about what it might be like to be somewhere that mirror was not. "All right," she said. It was not a grand decision. It did not feel like one. It felt like the only piece of arithmetic that actually balanced. Tom Brannigan nodded once as if something had been settled. "I'll need a day to arrange some things," Clara said. "I'll be at Gus's store tomorrow at noon," he said. "We can sort the details then." He picked up his coat from where he had set it on the corner of a shelf, and he walked to the back door, and then he paused. "Those apple butter thing," he said. "The ones Gus had on Wednesday." "Turnovers," Clara said, "with a little cardamom in the filling." He was quiet for a moment, as if turning this over. "If you can make those at Willow Bend," he said, "I think we'll manage." He walked out into the cold October night, and Clara stood alone in the back room of Gus Peterson's store, and she held very still, and she breathed, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the small, careful beginning of it. The thing that comes just before hope, when you have spent so long in the dark that you have forgotten the dark is not the whole world, and then very quietly a door opened somewhere. She finished her deliveries. She walked home through the empty streets of Millhaven in the October cold, her breath making small clouds, her sturdy, capable body carrying her through the dark with the quiet competence it always had, and she began methodically to think about what she would need to pack. She packed 2 bags. That was all she allowed herself. One held her practical things, 2 changes of sturdy clothing, a bar of soap, her father's old pocket watch, and a wool blanket her grandmother had made from remnants and patience during a winter that neither of them had lived to see repeated. The second bag held the recipe books. She wrapped them the way Mabel had wrapped them in the flour sack dish towel, and she bound them with the same length of kitchen twine, because some things deserved to be treated with ceremony even when no one was watching. She left the rest of the house exactly as it was. The furniture, the curtains, the stack of medical bills on the study desk, all of it. She left the cracked mirror in her bedroom without looking at it. That at least she was certain she could do. She met Tom at Gus's store at noon, as he had said. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the counter with a cup of Gus's terrible coffee and a piece of paper on which he had written out a simple accounting of what he intended to pay to the bank and to the county medical billing office. He pushed it across the counter to her without comment, the way a person pushes a map across a table, something practical and necessary, not a gift, not a gesture of charity, just information. Clara read it. The numbers were accurate. She had done her own accounting often enough to know them precisely. "This will clear it," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, patient and undemanding. "Why?" she said, not accusingly, simply needing to understand the architecture of what she was agreeing to. Tom set down his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is actually thinking rather than pausing for effect. "Because I need the help," he said, "and because it's a sound use of money that would otherwise sit in an account doing nothing useful, and because," he paused again, briefer this time, "I watched you carry 50 pounds of flour through a back alley alone in the middle of the night to pay debts that aren't even yours. And I thought that was about the most unreasonable thing I'd ever seen, and I've seen some unreasonable things." "The debts are mine," Clara said quietly. "My father's debts are mine." Something moved across his face, brief and complicated. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that's exactly the point." Gus, who had been polishing the same section of counter for approximately 4 minutes, looked up and said, "Clara, I'll miss you something terrible, but I think you should go." He said it the way Gus said most things, plainly, with his whole large, honest heart right there in the open. "And Tom, you bring her back to visit, and buy more of those turnovers when you come." They left Millhaven that afternoon in Tom's wagon, a solid working vehicle with no pretensions, pulled by 2 horses that were big-boned and sensible, the kind of animals chosen for capability rather than appearance. The town did not make any particular note of their departure. A few faces turned from windows. Old Mrs. Henshaw from the corner house watched them from her porch, with an expression of careful blankness that Clara recognized as the face people wore when they were storing something up to discuss later. Clara looked at Mrs. Henshaw as the wagon rolled past, and then she looked away, and she did not look back. The road west from Millhaven ran through 40 miles of farmland before the character of the landscape began to change. The well-tended fields gave way gradually to harder ground, stonier, drier, where the grass grew in clumps rather than carpets, and the trees were fewer and more wind-shaped, leaning permanently away from the prevailing westerly, as if in the middle of a long, slow argument. The sky got bigger as the cultivated land thinned, a wide, pale autumn sky with high clouds moving fast, and Clara found that she had been holding her breath for years and was only now beginning to release it. They did not talk a great deal on that first day. Tom drove with the ease of a man comfortable in silence, and Clara sat beside him and watched the countryside change and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a novelty. By the time the light began to drop toward the horizon, they had covered most of the distance. Tom pulled the wagon off the road at a small way-station inn and arranged for 2 rooms, not one which he had done without discussion or explanation, simply because it was the correct and obvious thing to do. And Clara noted this with the careful attention she gave to all information about who a person actually was versus who they presented themselves as being. They ate supper in the inn's small dining room, a plain meal, beef stew and bread and hot cider, and it was there across a simple wooden table, with a candle burning between them, that the conversation found its way into something more than logistics. "Tell me about Willow Bend," Clara said. Tom looked at his cider for a moment. "It's hard land," he said. "I won't dress it up differently than that. The soil is workable if you know what you're doing with it, which means winter wheat and maybe a kitchen garden, not the kind of farming I grew up with. There's a creek that runs year-round if the season cooperates. And the light is different out there." He paused as if surprised to have said it. "In the morning, when the sun comes up over the plain, there's a quality to it. I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't seen it." "Try," Clara said. He looked at her. "It's like the light is doing what it actually is," he said slowly, "instead of what it's supposed to be. No trees to soften it, no hills to ease it in gradually. It just comes all at once, and the whole world goes from dark to real in about 30 seconds. He stopped. "That probably sounds ridiculous." "It sounds like something worth waking up for," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment longer than he had looked at her before, and then he looked back at his cider. "What about the property itself?" she said. "The house." "4 rooms," he said. "2 of them usable without significant repair. A main room that serves as kitchen and sitting area, and a bedroom off the back. There's a second bedroom that needs a new roof section before it's weather-tight. I've been sleeping in the barn." He said this without any self-pity, just as a statement of the current arrangement. The well is sound. The wood stove works. The barn needs its south wall rebuilt before winter. And there's an area off the kitchen that someone intended to use as a larder, but never properly finished. Clara was quiet, working through all of this with the methodical attention she gave to a complex recipe, identifying the sequence of steps, estimating the time, and materials, calculating what was urgent and what could wait. "The bedroom with the damaged roof," she said. "Is the floor sound? Mostly. There's one section near the window that would need to be looked at." "I can help with the patching," she said. "I've done roof work before. Our house on Sycamore had a section over the back porch that went bad 5 years ago, and my father couldn't manage it physically by then, so I did it." She said this simply, not as a boast, just as a relevant fact. Tom looked at her with an expression she was already beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was distinguished from other people's versions by the fact that it did not look like admiration, so much as it looked like reassessment, a quiet internal recalculation. "All right," he said. "I'll need a proper kitchen space," she said. "Not immediately, but eventually. If the arrangement is going to work long-term, I'll need to be able to bake seriously, not just for the household. There are markets at Willow Bend Town Center on Saturdays." "I know it," he said. "What do you need for the kitchen?" "To start a larger work surface and better shelving. The wood stove, if it's a good one, can do double duty for baking if we're careful about the temperature management. Later, if things go well, a proper bread oven would make a significant difference." Tom nodded slowly. "One thing at a time," he said. "One thing at a time," Clara agreed. They arrived at the Willow Bend property the following morning, just as the sun was doing exactly what Tom had described, coming up over the flat plain, all at once sudden and unmediated, turning the dry grass to bronze and filling the enormous sky with a light that had no apologies in it. Clara sat in the wagon and looked at it and said nothing. But she breathed in very slowly and let the light come. The house was exactly as Tom had described it. 4 rooms, 2 functional, a wood stove that was sound and well-made, a well with clean, cold water, and everywhere the particular bleakness of a space that has been lived in only barely and without warmth. There were no curtains. There was 1 wooden chair and a table that had been made by someone who valued utility over beauty, which was a philosophy Clara had no objection to, in principle, though she thought beauty and utility were not required to be mutually exclusive. There was dust on every surface and the cold smell of a space that had been closed up too long. She stood in the center of the main room for a long moment and let her eyes move over all of it. Tom stood in the doorway and watched her, giving her the space to take it in without commentary. "It's got good bones," she said finally. He made a small sound that was as close to a laugh as she had yet heard from him. She set down her bags and took off her coat and rolled up her sleeves, and she went to work. The first week at Willow Bend was the kind of work that does not leave room for the kind of thinking that tends to happen in quiet hours. From first light to the last of the useful daylight, they were both in motion. Tom attacking the barn's south wall with timber he had sourced from a lumber yard in town, and Clara doing something that she had rarely been permitted to do in the whole of her life. She was transforming a space. She started with the main room. She scrubbed every surface until the smell of cold and neglect was replaced by the smell of soap and wood smoke. She sorted through the assortment of mismatched items in the larder and established a system. She found in a corner of the barn 2 wooden crates that Tom had no use for, and she brought them in and used them as additional shelving after she had sanded down the rough edges. She made curtains from a length of burlap she found in the general store in Willow Bend Town, 2 miles down the road, and they were not elegant curtains, but they were the right color, a warm, unbleached ivory that caught the morning light and held it. She baked on the second morning. She had found enough in Tom's basic supplies for a proper loaf of bread, and she worked the dough at the kitchen table before dawn by lamplight, and when Tom came in from checking the horses at first light, the smell of baking bread hit him in the doorway, and he stopped. He stood there for a moment, a man who had been sleeping in a barn and eating camp food for 2 weeks, and the particular quality of his stillness had something in it that Clara, even in her practiced invisibility, could not quite miss. "It'll be ready in about 20 minutes, she said, without looking up from where she was wiping down the table. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, but entirely without performance, simply meant. She looked up then briefly, and then looked back down at the table. That was how the first weeks went. 2 people working with the efficient, respectful proximity of partners who have agreed on the terms and intend to honor them. Tom did not crowd her. He did not make conversation that required her to perform ease she did not feel. He said what needed to be said about the work, asked her opinion when she had relevant knowledge, which was more often than he had probably expected, and otherwise left her to the interior of her own life, which was the most considerate thing he could have done. The second bedroom got its roof section patched on a Thursday afternoon. Clara worked the upper section while Tom steadied the ladder, and she was methodical and sure-handed and not afraid of the height. And when they came down and stood looking up at the repaired section in the thin autumn light, there was a satisfaction in it that had nothing to do with anyone watching. The room was habitable by the weekend. Tom moved out of the barn. Clara moved from the main room where she had been sleeping near the wood stove into the back bedroom. She had a door she could close. She had a window that faced east toward that unmediated morning light. She lay in her narrow bed on the first night and listened to the wind moving across the plain and to the distant sound of Tom's horses shifting in the barn, and she thought that this was against all reasonable expectation something she could call her own. The days found a rhythm. Tom was up before dawn out to the animals and the fencing and the ongoing never-finished work of the land. Clara was up at the same hour, stoking the wood stove, beginning whatever baking the day called for, managing the household with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She learned the land's vocabulary quickly, which way the wind usually came, where the ground was softest after rain, which of the 2 horses, a chestnut mare named Bertie and a steadier gray gelding Tom called Macready, could be trusted to stand without being tied. She learned that Tom took his coffee, black and strong, and did not want to talk for the first 20 minutes of the morning, which she respected completely because she felt the same way. She learned that he worked until his body told him to stop, rather than until the clock told him to, and that he had a habit in the evenings after supper of sitting on the front step with his arms on his knees, looking out at the darkening plain in the way of a man who is conducting some ongoing internal accounting that he does not intend to share unless invited. One evening in the 4th week, she brought 2 cups of cider to the front step and sat down beside him. Not close. Simply beside him with the cider in the cold evening air. He took the cup. He did not comment on the gesture. After a while, he said, "The south wheat field is going to need more preparation than I thought. The soil's got a hardpan layer about 8 inches down. If I can break through it before the ground freezes, spring planting has a real chance. If I can't." He stopped. "What happens if you can't?" Clara said. "Then I'm dependent on the kitchen garden income for another season, and that's tight. Very tight." Clara looked out at the plain. The last of the light was leaving the sky in long horizontal bands, amber, and then rose, and then a deep blue-gray that the stars were beginning to press through from the other side. "What would break through hardpan?" she said. "Deep plowing, which takes equipment I don't have. Is there anyone in Willow Bend who would lend or hire the equipment?" Tom was quiet. "There's a man named Calloway who has a steel plow with the right blade. We've spoken. He's not unfriendly." "Then speak to him again," Clara said, "with a different currency if money's the obstacle. His wife comes to the Saturday market. She bought 2 loaves of my sourdough last week and came back for a third. People will do a great deal for something they can't easily get elsewhere." Tom looked at her. In the fading light, his expression was difficult to read, but there was something in it that had not been there. In the first days, a kind of attentiveness that was different from his usual practical regard. "That's a sound thought," he said. "It's a transaction," she said, "which is something I understand." She stood up and took her cup inside, and the evening closed behind her, quiet and enormous and full of stars, and neither of them said anything more about it. But 2 days later, Tom came back from town with the use of Calloway's steel plow arranged for the following week, and he said only, "Mrs. Calloway asked if you'd be willing to do a standing order for 2 loaves every Saturday," and Clara said, "Tell her yes," and that was that. The hard pan broke. The winter wheat went in before the first hard frost. And somewhere in the cold working days of November, between the bread and the fencing, and the cider on the front step, and the vast, honest light of the Willow Bend morning, something else was breaking too slowly, and without announcement, the long, patient ice around a heart that had been told for 29 years that it was not worth warming. The winter came to Willow Bend Prairie the way it always came to that particular stretch of Ohio flatland, not gradually, not with any of the polite warning signs that softer country provided, but all at once, a hard north wind, arriving in the second week of December, that scoured the plain clean of everything provisional and left only what was genuinely built to last. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Tom's property skinned over with ice by morning. The horses grew their heavy winter coats and stood close together in the barn with the philosophical patience of animals that understand endurance without needing to discuss it. Clara understood endurance too. She had been practicing it her entire life. But there was a difference she was beginning to discover between enduring something and actually living inside it, and that difference was the thing that Willow Bend was slowly, quietly teaching her. The days had a weight to them now. That was not the weight of burden, but of substance. She was up before Tom most mornings, which was not easy, given that Tom rose before the sun with the regularity of a man who has made a private agreement with the dawn. She would have the wood stove going and the first pot of coffee ready by the time she heard his boots on the floor of the main room, and he would come in from the cold with his coat smelling of wood smoke and horses, and take the cup she set on the table without ceremony, and they would each occupy their own corner of the morning quiet, which had become without either of them acknowledging it. One of the most companionable silences Clara had ever known. She baked every day now. Not the careful rationed, middle-of-the-night baking of Millhaven, where every batch had to justify itself against the risk of being seen, but real baking, full and generous and unafraid. She baked 4 loaves at a time instead of 2. She made pies from the dried apples and the last of the autumn preserves. She made a gingerbread from Mabel's recipe, the one with the black pepper and the dark molasses, and the smell of it filled every room of the small house and drifted out through the cracks in the doorframe and into the cold air outside. And Tom came in from the barn one afternoon, following that smell with the directness of a man who has given up pretending he is not affected by it, and said simply, "Whatever that is, I hope there's enough of it." "There's enough," she said. He sat at the table, and she set a thick slice in front of him, and he ate it with the serious, focused appreciation of someone who is not eating for the performance of enjoying food, but because the food is genuinely extraordinary. And Clara stood at the stove with her back to him, and allowed herself very quietly the small and private pleasure of having made something that was worth the making. She went to the Saturday market every week through December, loading the wagon before dawn, in the dark and cold, her breath making clouds, her powerful arms making nothing of the crates and baskets that would have challenged someone of lighter build. She drove the 2 miles into Willow Bend town alone, because Tom had work on the property that could not always wait, and she did not need him there, which was a new thought and one that she turned over with some wonder. She did not need someone beside her to make it possible. She simply went. The market was held in a long covered hall on the edge of the town square, and it was there that Clara first felt the difference between Willowbend and Millhaven with a clarity that was almost physical. These were hard country people, ranch wives, and dry goods farmers and working families who measured everything by its practical value and wasted very little energy on the kind of social arithmetic that Millhaven had elevated to an art form. They came to her table and they looked at the bread and the pastries and the pies, and they bought them, and they said things like, "That sourdough lasted 4 days in our house, which has never happened before." And, "My husband said that gingerbread was the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's, and he doesn't say things like that about just anything." And then they paid, and they left, and they came back the following Saturday. Nobody looked at her the way Millhaven had looked at her. Or if they did not look long enough to make it a statement. They were too busy with their own survival to invest energy in cataloging another person's appearance. It was, Clara thought, possibly the most democratic thing she had ever encountered, but the walls were still there. Inside the house, inside the warm radius of Willowbend, and the daily work and the mornings with Tom, the walls were still there, and they went up fastest and most impenetrably when Tom's attention moved toward her in a way that was not purely practical. It happened in small moments. He would come to the kitchen to get his coffee and find her working the dough at the table, her broad shoulders moving with the rhythm of it, her strong hands turning and pressing, and he would pause for just a fraction of a second longer than the coffee required. She felt those pauses the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives in some peripheral physical awareness that bypassed thought entirely. She did not know what to do with them. She did not know what to do with the evening 2 weeks before Christmas when he came back from town with supplies and set a package on the kitchen table wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of red ribbon and said without quite meeting her eyes, "There was a dry goods store on the corner. I thought with winter being what it is." She looked at the package. It was not large. She looked at the red ribbon. "Open it," he said. He was standing at the door, still in his coat, doing something with his gloves that did not require the attention he was giving it. Clara untied the ribbon carefully, the way she handled everything fragile, and folded back the brown paper. Inside was a length of fabric warm amber gold, the color of the light that came over the plain on clear winter mornings, a wool blend that was soft and well-made, and entirely unlike the dark, concealing, shape-defeating fabrics she had worn for the whole of her adult life. She stared at it. The warmth of it, the color of it, the simple fact of it, a thing chosen for her, not for utility, but for something else. Something that said, "I see you. I think you are worth color. I think you deserve to be visible," hit her somewhere she was not defended against, and the hit was catastrophic. She pushed back from the table. The fabric fell from her hands. She was on her feet before she fully understood that she had stood up, and the voice that came into her head was not her own voice. It was Vivian's voice, perfectly level, perfectly pleasant, and it said exactly what it had always said. You draw attention to yourself in that color. Clara, people are already looking. Do not make it worse. You are an embarrassment to yourself and to this family. You are too much. You take up too much space. No amount of fabric or color is going to change what you fundamentally are. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. Clara. Tom's voice was very quiet. He had not moved from the door. "I'm sorry," she said. She could not look at him. "I can't. I'm sorry. It's very kind of you, but I can't. Please take it back. Please give it to someone who can." "Who can what?" he said. "Wear it." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Someone who can wear something like that. Without people without. She stopped. She was aware that she was not making sense, and she was aware that not making sense in front of another person was one of the things she had spent her whole life preventing, and the awareness of that made everything considerably worse. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. The tears came anyway. She turned away from him toward the window because the window was the only direction that did not have a person in it, and she said to the dark glass and the winter plain beyond it in a voice that she despised for its shaking. She used to say when I was small, she would say bright colors only work for women who have something worth showing. And I know it was cruel. I know she was wrong about a great many things, but I have heard it so many times that I cannot hear anything else when I see something like this. I'm sorry. Please just... There was a silence. Then she heard him cross the room, not toward her, toward the wall beside the bedroom door where she had hung, out of some habit she had not fully examined, the one thing she had brought from Millhaven that she should probably have left behind. The cracked hand mirror, oval-shaped in a tarnished silver frame, that had hung on her mother's dressing table for as long as Clara could remember, and that Vivian had left behind with the same casual thoroughness with which she had left behind everything else that no longer served her purposes. She heard him take it from the wall. She heard a moment later the specific sound of something being broken deliberately, not the accident sound of something falling, but the intentional, controlled sound of someone making a decision, and she turned from the window. He had taken the mirror to the stone hearth and brought the frame down against the corner of it with a single, clean, definitive movement. The glass had fractured cleanly. He set the pieces down on the hearth with care so nothing would cut, and he straightened up and turned to face her. His expression was not angry. Anger would have been easier to manage. It was something more serious than anger, something that had the quality of absolute conviction. "I didn't marry a ghost," he said. His voice was low and entirely steady. "And I am not living with your mother. I will not have her in this house." He looked at the broken mirror on the hearth. "There are no more mirrors in this house. The only way you see yourself now is through my eyes." He looked at her then directly with the same gray-green eyes that had looked at her in that back alley in Millhaven without looking away or looking past. And he said, "And what I see is a beautiful, incredible woman who has worked harder than anyone I have ever known, and who has been told the wrong story about herself for so long she has forgotten that it is just a story. It is not the truth, Clara. It has never once been the truth." The room was very still. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved over the plain. Clara looked at him. She looked at the broken mirror on the hearth. She looked at the amber gold fabric still on the table where she had dropped it. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for so many years that the clenching had come to feel like her natural shape shifted. Not broke, not yet the breaking of something that deeply ingrained takes longer than a single moment, but shifted, like the first small crack in ice that is the beginning of the whole river moving again. She did not say anything. She could not. Not yet. But she crossed the room and picked up the length of amber gold fabric from the table and held it in both hands, and she let herself feel the softness of it without immediately searching for a reason to put it down. Tom watched her for a moment. Then he went to the wood stove and added another log to the fire, because the night was cold and the practical needs of the world did not stop for the important ones, and because he understood without requiring it to be explained that she needed him to give her a moment to be alone inside what had just happened. The following Sunday, she wore the amber gold dress to the market. She had sewn it herself in the evenings of the week between by lamplight at the kitchen table, and she had not made it shapeless or dark or designed to disappear. She had made it honestly in the shape of her actual body, broad and strong and unashamed. And when she looked down at her own hands as she arranged the bread on the market table, and the color caught the thin winter light, she had the vertiginous sensation of seeing herself from a distance for the first time. Not through Vivian's eyes, not through Millhaven's eyes, but from somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter and more accurate. Two women at the market complimented the dress. She thanked them. She did not deflect the compliment or qualify it or immediately redirect attention away from herself. She simply said, "Thank you. I made it," and moved on, and the world did not end. Tom was home when she got back. He was on the front step with his coffee, which was unusual for midday, and she understood he had been listening for the wagon. When she came around the side of the house and he saw her, there was a moment brief and unguarded where his expression said something that he had not yet said in words. Then it was back to his ordinary face, practical and composed. "Good market," he said. "Very good," she said. "I sold everything by 10 o'clock. There were 3 people who asked about standing orders." "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. She went inside. But she was smiling as she went, which was, she realized, something she had been doing more frequently in recent weeks, smiling when no one was watching for no reason connected to performance or social obligation, but simply because the internal weather had changed and the face was reporting it honestly. December folded into January, and January into the long, blue, cold weeks of February, and the property took shape, the way hard things take shape slowly, stubbornly, with more setbacks than celebrations, but unmistakably. The south wheat field was dormant under its thin snow waiting. The barn's repaired wall held against the worst storms. The kitchen at the Willow Bend house had become, by anyone's reasonable assessment, a serious working space with proper shelving and an organized larder and a work table that Tom had built over a long weekend from good oak planks, wider than the old one, and perfectly leveled so that the dough never slid and the pastry rolled true. He had built it without announcing his intention. He had measured the space one evening quietly while she was writing out her market list, and she had noticed the measuring and said nothing, and the following Saturday when she came back from the market, the old table was in the barn, and the new one was in its place, already sanded to a satiny smoothness, with no rough edges anywhere. She had run her hands along the surface and felt the quality of the work, the care in it, the long, unhurried attention, and she had understood that the table was not just a table. She had understood that it was the same kind of thing as the amber gold fabric, a statement made in the language of action by a man who was considerably more fluent in that language than in the spoken kind. She did not say anything to him about it that evening. But she made his supper with extra care, the particular beef stew he liked, with the thick gravy and the root vegetables and the biscuits that she dropped into the pot in the last 20 minutes, so that they steamed through and absorbed the flavor. And when he came in from the evening chores and sat down to it, he looked at the bowl for a moment, and then looked across the table at her. "This is the stew I told you about," he said, "the one my mother used to make." "Yes," she said. He understood that she had listened months ago to a passing remark he had probably not expected to be retained. His jaw tightened briefly with something that he managed without much difficulty, and he looked back at his bowl. "Thank you," he said. Just that. The weeks continued their quiet accumulating work. And between Tom Brannigan and Clara June Whitlock in the evenings by the wood stove and the mornings over coffee, and the long working days of the prairie winter, something was being built that had no blueprint and required no announcement, something patient and foundational and entirely real. The kind of thing that does not arrive all at once, but that you recognize when you finally stop to look, has been there for some time, solid as the oak work table, and warm as the amber gold dress in the winter light. But Clara's walls, though cracked, were not gone, and the deepest one, the one that Vivian had built first, and most carefully, the one that said, "Your worth is conditional, and your belonging is earned, and the moment you stop being useful, you will be left." That wall was still standing. And it would take something far more catastrophic than a broken mirror to bring it fully down. Spring came to Willow Bend Prairie like a promise that had been kept against considerable odds. The snow retreated from the fields in slow, reluctant stages through March, and the creek unfroze with a sound like something exhaling after a long-held breath. And by the first week of April, the winter wheat that Tom had fought the hardpan earth to plant was showing itself in thin, determined rows of green that caught the morning light and held it. Tom walked those rows every day. Clara watched him from the kitchen window. Sometimes this tall, weathered man moving slowly along the edge of his field with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the ground, and she understood that what she was seeing was not a man inspecting a crop. She was seeing a man conducting a conversation with the land about whether it intended to honor its part of an agreement, and the land slowly and without enthusiasm, but with a certain undeniable integrity, was beginning to say yes. The property had changed through the winter in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible ways were practical and satisfying. The barn was sound. The south field was planted. The kitchen was a serious working space now, and Clara's standing orders at the Saturday market had grown from 3 households to 11, which meant that she was baking 5 days a week and delivering on Saturdays and bringing in a reliable income that had begun quietly and without fanfare to contribute meaningfully to the property's economics. Tom had mentioned this once in the direct, unornamented way he mentioned things that mattered. Sitting at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of him one evening. In February, he had said, "You should know that your market income is the reason the seed bill got paid in full." And Clara had looked at her hands and said, "Good," and meant it completely. The invisible changes were harder to name, but no less real. They lived in the texture of the daily life they had built together, in the way Tom had started leaving the account book open on the table rather than putting it away before she came in, because she had a sharp eye for numbers and had caught 2 errors in his tallying that had mattered. In the way Clara had stopped eating her meals, standing at the kitchen counter with her back half turned, which had been her habit in the early months, a leftover from years of being made to feel that her physical presence at a table was an imposition, and had started sitting across from Tom in the evenings, both of them with their plates and their conversation or their comfortable silence, like 2 people who had agreed without saying so that they belonged at the same table. There had been one evening in late February when Tom had reached across the table to pass her the salt, and his hand had brushed hers, a glancing accidental contact that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. And Clara had gone very still, and Tom had gone very still, and then they had both continued eating, but something had changed in the air of the room that neither of them addressed directly, and neither of them forgot. She thought about that moment more than she would have admitted. She thought about it while she was working the dough in the mornings, and while she was driving the wagon to market, and while she was lying in her eastward-facing room at night, listening to the vast, quiet breathing of the prairie. She thought about it with a feeling she could not entirely trust, because the feeling was unfamiliar enough that she kept checking it for structural defects, kept looking for the place where it was going to give way. She had spent her whole life being told that she was not the kind of woman that a man like Tom Brannigan looked at with anything except the practical consideration owed to a useful arrangement. Vivian's voice said this so reliably and so fluently that it had become a form of background noise, always running, always there. But then there were the moments that made the voice harder to hear. The table he had built for her, the amber gold fabric, the evenings on the front step with the cider, and the enormous darkening sky, and the way he listened to her, actually listened, the way no one in her life had ever quite managed. And there were newer moments, too. Quieter ones a morning in March when she came out of her room with her hair unbound because she had forgotten to pin it before coming to the stove, and Tom had looked up from the table and then looked back down at his coffee with an expression that she had caught and stored away in the part of her that was learning slowly and against considerable resistance to believe the evidence of what she actually saw. By April, they were no longer operating under the strict terms of the original pragmatic arrangement, though neither of them had formally renegotiated it. They had simply, through the accumulated weight of the winter and the work, and the shared mornings and the broken mirror and the amber dress, become something that the original terms had not accounted for and could not adequately describe. They had not said this to each other. Tom was not a man who said things before he was certain of them, and Clara was not a woman who trusted easily enough to say them first. But it was there, solid and warm and entirely real in the space between them. It was in April on a Saturday when Clara came back from market with the wagon empty and the account envelope satisfyingly full that Tom met her in the yard with an expression she had not seen on him before, something animated and forward-leaning, something that on another face she might have called excitement, but on Tom's face presented more like the look of a man who has solved a problem he has been working on for a long time. "Come and see something," he said, before she had finished climbing down from the wagon. He took her around the side of the house to the back to the area off the kitchen that she had always thought of as the unfinished larder, because that was what it had been when they arrived, a small roofed extension with 3 walls and a dirt floor that someone had begun and then abandoned. She had been using it for cold storage through the winter, which was a reasonable but limited use of the space. It was no longer a 3D-walled cold storage space. Sometime in the past week, while she had been baking and delivering and managing the Saturday market, Tom had been working back here. The 4th wall was up solid timber properly fitted. The floor had been laid with flat stone level and well jointed. And on the north wall, built into the stone foundation with the careful, serious craftsmanship of someone who had researched what he was building and then built it with his whole attention, was the beginning of a proper bread oven. A real one, the kind that holds heat for hours, the kind that Clara had described only once on an evening in November when they were talking about the market's potential, saying almost in passing, a proper bread oven would make all the difference to the volume I could produce. He had remembered. He had measured and sourced and built. She stood in the doorway of what was no longer a larder and looked at the stone oven and at the 4 sound walls and at the flat stone floor, and she could not speak for a moment. Not because she was unhappy, but because the happiness was so unfamiliar in this particular form. Happiness that was not about something she had done, but about something that had been done for her, about being seen and remembered and valued in a way that required no performance and no justification that she did not immediately have the right container for it. "It needs the iron door fitted yet," Tom said behind her. "And the flue work on the exterior. Another week, maybe 10 days. He paused. "I thought with the summer market season coming, if you want to scale up the bread production." "Tom," she said, "it's a practical investment," he said. "The margin on the sourdough loaves alone." "Tom," she said again, and something in the way she said it the second time made him stop. She turned around. He was standing in the yard just outside the doorway, his hands in his coat pockets, the April sunlight behind him, and he was watching her with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "Thank you," she said. It was not an adequate thing to say. She knew that, but she said it with her whole self behind it, and he received it with his whole self, which made it adequate after all. "You're welcome," he said simply. She turned back to the oven and ran her hands along the stonework, feeling the quality of it, the care in the joinery, and Tom stood in the April sunlight and let her have the moment, and somewhere in the back of her mind a voice that sounded like Vivian tried to say something and found that it had considerably less room than it used to. They finished the oven together over the following 10 days, Clara working alongside Tom on the flue fitting and the iron door installation with the same sure-handed competence she brought to everything physical. And when they fired it for the first time on a Wednesday evening in late April, when the heat built in the stone cavity with a deep, radiating permanence that a conventional wood stove could never match. Clara put in the first 4 loaves, and she and Tom sat on upturned crates in the new room and waited, and the smell of the bread building in that serious, sustained heat was different from any bread she had ever baked before. Richer. More itself. When she pulled the loaves out and set them on the stone shelf to cool, Tom cut into the first one before it was fully cool, which is something you are not supposed to do with sourdough, but which she allowed because the circumstances were exceptional, and he ate a piece standing up with no butter or accompaniment of any kind, just the bread itself, and he closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, which was as close as Tom Brannigan ever came to an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. June arrived, and the wheat was unmistakably thriving, and with it the ranch began to feel like something real, rather than something aspirational. The Saturday market had become a significant event for Clara, not the furtive backdoor transaction of Millhaven, but a real presence, a table in a good spot, regulars who came specifically for her bread and her pastries, a growing reputation in Willow Bend for a quality of baking that the town had not previously had access to. She stood at that table in the amber dress which she had let out slightly through the seams as summer came and which she wore without apology, and she talked to people, actually talked to them in the direct and friendly way that had always been natural to her, but that she had spent years suppressing in the belief that directness from someone who looked like her was unwelcome. She found that it was not unwelcome. She found that most people responded to warmth with warmth, which was perhaps the most obvious thing in the world, and yet had managed to remain opaque to her for 29 years. It was in June that Tom's behavior shifted in a way that was small and specific and unmistakable. He started coming to the market on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, not ostentatiously, not in a way that announced itself. He would arrive mid-morning with some plausible errand in the town center, and he would come by her table, and he would stand for a while, not helping, not hovering, simply being there. And Clara noticed that his presence at the edge of her table had the effect of altering the quality of the social space around her in a way that she found simultaneously annoying, and if she was being honest with herself, deeply reassuring. She told him this one evening. They were sitting on the front step, late June, the sky still holding the last of the light, at 8:30, and she said without particular preamble, "You don't need to come to the market, you know. I'm perfectly capable of managing it alone." "I know that," he said. "Then why do you come?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was actually thinking. "Because I want to," he said. "Is that a sufficient reason?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." He looked back at the horizon. After a moment he said, "Is it unwelcome?" "No," she said. And then, because she was a woman who had committed herself at considerable cost to the practice of honesty, she said, "It is the opposite of unwelcome." He nodded once slowly, as if something had been confirmed that he had suspected but needed to hear directly. He did not say anything more, but his shoulder where it rested close to hers on the narrow step was warm through the fabric of her dress, and neither of them moved away. The summer deepened. July brought the kind of heat that turned the prairie to gold and pushed the days out long at both ends, and the wheat came in, and it was a good harvest. Not a spectacular one, the land was still in the early stages of its relationship with Tom's particular way of farming it, but a sound one enough to clear the remaining debt from the spring seed bill and put aside a modest reserve against next year. Tom received this news from the granary assessor in town with the same expression he gave to most good news, a brief controlled acknowledgment that said, "This matters to me," and then a return to what needed doing next. What needed doing next, Tom had decided, was the bakery. Not a room off the kitchen, not a market table. An actual bakery in Willow Bend town on the main street where Clara could operate a proper commercial establishment. He had been looking at a vacant property on the corner of the main commercial block for 2 months, he told her one evening in late July, after supper with the account books open between them, because he had found that conversations conducted with the account books open went better with Clara, who trusted numbers more than she trusted declarations. She stared at him. "That's a significant investment," she said. "Yes," he said. "The harvest reserve wouldn't cover the build-out." "No." but there's a loan available through the County Agricultural Bank for commercial agricultural enterprises, and a bakery that sources from a local wheat farm qualifies." He pushed a piece of paper across the table. He had already done the research. He had already done the preliminary paperwork. He had done all of this quietly in the spaces between the other work, the way he did everything that mattered. Clara looked at the paper. She looked at the numbers. They were sound. She looked across the table at Tom. "You did all this," she said. "You've been selling out every Saturday for 4 months," he said. "There's a demand that your current capacity can't meet. That's not sentiment, that's arithmetic." "Tom." "The arithmetic is sound, Clara." "I know the arithmetic is sound," she said. "I'm not talking about the arithmetic." He was quiet. He looked at her directly, as he always did, when something actually needed to be looked at. "I know," he said finally, quietly. "I know what you're talking about." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the paper and said, "All right," and her voice was steady, and her heart was not. And both of those things were true at the same time, which she was learning was frequently the condition of being fully alive. They broke ground on the bakery in August. Tom built it with his own hands and the help of 2 men from town whom he paid a fair wage, and Clara was there every day, not standing back and watching, but working alongside them, hauling materials and mixing mortar and making decisions about the interior layout, with the authority of someone who has spent years understanding exactly what a professional baking operation requires. She designed the kitchen herself on paper at the oak table in the evenings, and Tom looked at her drawings and said, "This works," which was the highest form of architectural praise in his vocabulary. It was on the 3rd week of the building, on a Wednesday night in mid-August, when the walls were up and the roof was being framed, that the sky above Willow Bend Prairie turned the particular color of old pewter that people in that country knew to take seriously. A flat, heavy, lightless gray that descended from the northwest, with a speed and a deliberateness that was not wind and not storm, but something older and more indifferent than either. Tom came in from the building site in the early evening and looked at the sky, and his face went very still. "How much rain can that bring?" Clara said. She was standing in the kitchen doorway watching the same sky. "That's not a rain front," Tom said. He was quiet for a moment. "Get the recipe books inside and get them to the high shelf. Everything off the floor in the larder. I'm going to move the horses to the ridge shelter." He was already moving. "Tom, what is that?" He looked at her over his shoulder, and his expression was the kind of controlled and serious that precedes the word that she already in her body knew was coming. "Flash flood," he said. "The creek is going to come over its banks by midnight. Move fast, Clara. We have maybe 3 hours." He was wrong about the 3 hours. They had 2. The water came without ceremony. It came the way the worst things come, not with a warning that allows for grace and preparation, but as a fact already in progress, a sound first, a low collective roar from the direction of the creek that was nothing like the sound of rain and nothing like the sound of wind, but was instead its own terrible language, the sound of a large volume of moving water that has decided it is no longer interested in its designated channel and intends to go where it pleases. Clara had the recipe books on the high shelf and the larder floor cleared before the first water came under the kitchen door. She had moved with the focused, unhurried speed of someone who has been physically capable her entire life and knows how to use that capability when it counts, lifting and carrying and securing with the efficiency of a woman who does not waste motion. When the thin, dark line of water slid across the kitchen floor at 11:43 at night, she had already done everything that could be done inside the house. Tom had the horses on the ridge. She could hear him somewhere outside his voice, carrying across the sound of the rising water as he worked to move what could be moved and secure what could be secured. And she knew he was making the calculations that a man makes in those circumstances, what is worth the risk of going back for, and what is not running that arithmetic fast in the dark while the water climbed. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, the water cold around her boots, the lamplight shifting on the rising surface, and she looked at the high shelf where the recipe books sat in their flour sack wrapping safe and dry and accounted for. She looked at the back door that led to the unfinished bakery, to the stone walls that Tom had built with his own hands over 3 weeks, to the bread oven in the side room with its carefully fitted iron door and its deep stone cavity that had taken a full day to properly fire for the first time. She told herself she was going to check that the oven door was sealed. She told herself it was a practical thing, a responsible thing, that water getting into the oven cavity could damage the stone, and the whole structure would need to be rebuilt, which was a real concern and a reasonable one, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the cold terror in her chest. That had nothing to do with the flood at all. She went out the back door into the dark and the rising water. It was deeper than she had expected already, to her knees in the low area between the house and the bakery structure, cold and moving with a muscular insistence that required genuine effort to push against. She was powerfully built, and she was not afraid of physical resistance, and she made the 20 feet to the bakery door without much difficulty, and she got the oven door checked and found it sound, and she was standing in the dark of the half-finished bakery with the water at her knees, and the roar of it filling every available space of sound and thought, when the true voice underneath all the practical reasoning made itself heard. It was not Vivian's voice this time, not the careful, pleasant, level-toned voice of instruction and diminishment. It was something older and more primal than that something that lived below language, a terror so fundamental that it did not bother with words, just with the raw animal conviction that she was going to lose all of this, the oven and the bakery and the bread and the market table and the amber dress and the oak work table and the cider on the front step and all of it. And when she lost it, she would be left with nothing to offer, nothing to justify her presence, nothing to make her worth keeping, and he would see that finally and clearly, the way people always eventually saw it, and he would do what people did when they saw it. She was not thinking rationally. She understood this distantly, the way you understand something through several layers of cold water and rising panic. But understanding it and stopping it were not the same operation, and the panic was faster than the understanding, and she was wading back out into the current, toward the unfinished bakery wall, some half-formed intention of shoring it up, of doing something, of being useful enough to justify what she was terrified of losing when she heard Tom's voice, not calling for her, screaming for her. "Clara! Clara! Get to the ridge! Get out of there right now! The creek wall is going—" She turned. The water was at her thighs now, and the current had genuine force in it, the kind of force that does not negotiate, and she could see in the darkness the white movement of faster water coming from the direction of the creek, the advance edge of the real surge, and she understood in her body what her mind had not yet finished processing, that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation about how much time she had. She turned toward the ridge. The current hit her sideways at that moment, the full leading edge of the creek surge, and it was not like being pushed. It was like the ground being replaced with something that had entirely different opinions about which direction she should be going. And she went down on one knee in the rushing dark water before her body caught itself, and drove upward through the sheer accumulated muscle of years of hard physical work. And she was fighting now, genuinely fighting, using everything her broad, strong, formidable body had to give, and it was enough to keep her upright, but not enough to make forward progress against the current that was now coming from 2 directions at once. Tom came into the water after her. She heard him before she saw him, the specific sound of someone large moving fast through a medium that resists fast movement. And then he was there, his hand closing around her arm with a grip that was not gentle, and was not meant to be the grip of a man who has decided that this one thing is not negotiable. And he pulled with his whole body weight, and she pushed with hers, and together they were enough. The way two people who each know how to work can be enough when neither of them alone would be. He got her to the ridge. It was a low rise of ground, 20 yards behind the house that sat just high enough above the floodplain to stay clear of the worst of it, and he pulled her up the slope, and they both went down on their knees in the wet grass at the top, breathing hard, the water roaring below them in the dark. She was shaking. Not from the cold, though the water had been very cold. From something else, from the adrenaline and the fear, and from the thing underneath the fear that she had not yet been able to look at directly. Tom was on his knees beside her, and his hands were on her face, and he was looking at her in the dark with an expression she could feel rather than see, his thumbs brushing the water from her cheeks, checking her, making sure she was whole. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was rough in a way it had never been in any of their evenings on the front step or their practical conversations over the account books, rough in the way of something that has been frightened past its capacity for composure. "No," she said. "I'm not hurt." "What were you doing?" he said. "What were you doing in there?" "Clara, I told you to get to the ridge. I told you." "The oven," she said, and even as she said it, she heard how it sounded, and he heard it too. "The oven," he repeated. He was still holding her face between his hands, and in the darkness above the roaring water, she could feel the quality of his stillness. The specific stillness of someone who is putting something together. "I thought if the water got into the stone cavity," she began. "Clara." His voice was low and entirely steady, which meant he was feeling something very strongly, because Tom Brannigan's voice only got that steady when it was carrying significant weight. "Look at me." She looked at him, or she looked at the dark shape of him in the darkness, which was the same thing. "Did you go into that flood for an oven?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Did you risk your life because you were afraid of losing a piece of equipment?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. The shaking in her body was moving from the outside inward, now finding the places where the truth lived. "If I can't bake," she said. Her voice was very small, which was not something she had ever permitted it to be in front of him before. "If I lose the oven and the bakery and the market, then I don't have anything I can't contribute anything that I cannot be someone who just—" She stopped. The words were coming apart in her hands, the way wet paper comes apart too waterlogged to hold their shape. "You built all of this with me, and if I lose the capacity to earn my part of it, if I lose the thing that makes me useful to this arrangement, you will see that I am just a—" The word that Vivian had never said out loud, but had communicated every day of Clara's life, rose in her throat. A burden. Just a person taking up space and consuming resources, and not giving back enough to justify. She heard herself say it. She heard how completely devastatingly her mother was still speaking through her, after all the months and all the work and the amber dress and the broken mirror and the oak table and the cider on the front step. After all of it, here was the foundational belief, untouched and operational, doing what it had always done. Tom made a sound that she had never heard from him before. It was not anger, not quite. It was the sound of something breaking through a surface that had held for a long time. He pulled her toward him and held her both arms around her, his chin on her wet hair, and he held her the way you hold something you have just come very close to losing with your whole body committed to the holding. And he said into her hair, rough and certain, and with every piece of himself behind it, "Are you crazy? Clara, are you out of your mind? I didn't marry an oven. I didn't build a life out here to maintain a useful arrangement. Land can be plowed again, and ovens can be rebuilt, and stone is just stone. But if I lose you, I lose everything that makes any of this worth the doing. Open your eyes. I love you. Not what you can do, not what you can bake or earn or contribute. You. Do you understand me? You." The flood roared below them in the dark. Clara pressed her face against his chest, and she let the words come in, not just hearing them, letting them in all the way in past the wall and past Vivian's voice and past the 29 years of careful instruction in her own inadequacy. Let them come in and sit down in the deepest place and stay there. Her hands gripped the front of his soaked coat. He held her tighter. She cried then. Not the controlled private afterward crying she had always done before, alone in a room with the door shut. She cried fully without management against Tom Brannigan's chest in the wet August darkness above a flooded prairie, and he did not tell her to stop or offer solutions or make any sound at all, except to hold her more firmly, which was the only right response, and he knew it. When the worst of it had passed and the water below them had reached its peak and begun almost imperceptibly to find its way back toward a channel, she lifted her head and said, I'm sorry about the oven." "Stop," he said. "The bakery wall on the south side is going to need Clara." There was something almost like laughter in his voice, or the edge of something that was adjacent to laughter, the kind that comes on the other side of being badly frightened. "Stop. We will look at all of it in the morning. Right now, I just need you to be here on this ridge, not in any floodwater. That is the only thing that matters to me at this moment. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. And he kept his arm around her, and they sat on the ridge above the receding flood in the dark August night, and the horses stood nearby in their philosophical patience, and the vast prairie sky above them was clearing from the west, and the first stars were beginning to show. She said quietly into the settling dark, "I love you too. I should have said it before now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been saying it for months," he said, in other languages. She thought about the beef stew made from a half-remembered remark. She thought about the way she had learned the horses' names and their individual temperaments, and which one needed an extra measure of patience on cold mornings. She thought about the evenings she had come out to the front step with 2 cups of cider without being asked. "I suppose I have," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been listening." The flood damage was assessed in the gray waterlogged light of the following morning. The creek had returned to its banks by dawn, leaving behind the particular devastation of water that has been somewhere it did not belong. A deep coating of silt over the low-ground debris caught in the fence lines, the south wall of the unfinished bakery partially collapsed where the surge had hit it broadside. The house had taken water to a depth of 8 inches on the ground floor. The kitchen would need to be scrubbed and the floorboards checked for warping. The wood stove was sound. The recipe books on the high shelf were untouched and perfectly dry. The bread oven was intact. Clara walked through the bakery structure in the morning light and found the oven standing exactly as it had stood the night before its iron door, sealed tight, its stone wall solid, Tom's careful joinery having held against everything the flood had sent against it. She put her hand on the stone and felt the faint residual warmth of its last firing still in it, stored deep in the mass of the material, the way good stone stores everything given to it. She thought about how she had gone into the water for this. She thought about Tom coming into the water after her. She thought about what he had said on the ridge, and she let herself feel in the full light of morning what it meant to be loved in a way that sends someone into a flood current after you, not because you are useful, not because you contribute to an arrangement, but simply because losing you is unacceptable. It was the first morning of the rest of her life, and she knew it, and she let herself know it without looking for the flaw. Willow Bend town had taken the flood badly across the board. The low-lying commercial district had 2 feet of water through it. Several families had lost significant property. The way station inn on the North Road had its ground floor gutted. People moved through the aftermath with the dazed, practical determination of a community that has been hit before and knows how to start over, but the starting over was going to take time, and in the meantime people were cold and muddy, and some of them were hungry. Clara assessed the situation on that first morning with the clear eyes of someone who has stopped thinking about herself long enough to see what is actually in front of her. She assessed the contents of her kitchen, elevated and dry. She assessed the state of the bread oven, sound and ready. She assessed the stockpile of flour and salt and the preserved stores in the high larder, and she did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that she could feed a significant number of people if she started immediately. She started immediately. She built the fire in the bread oven before the morning was an hour old, and she mixed the first 4 batches of dough by hand at the oak table while the oven came up to temperature, working with the full, unhurried power of her capable body. Not hiding her strength, but using all of it for exactly the purpose it had always been suited to. Tom came in at one point and looked at the scale of what she was doing at the rows of dough batches resting under cloth at the fire. Going in the oven at Clara herself, flour to the elbows and entirely focused, and he understood without being told, and went back out and rigged the wagon to make a delivery run. She baked for 2 days without stopping except to sleep 4 hours in the middle of the first night. She made bread loaf after loaf after loaf, the sourdough that Willowbend had come to know, and the dense, reliable sandwich loaves, and the soft rolls that could be eaten by people who had not managed to eat properly in 24 hours and needed something gentle. She made large pans of gingerbread because it was calorie-dense and kept well, and because Mabel had always said that people in hard circumstances needed something that tasted like someone cared, not just something that filled the space. Tom drove the wagon into town twice a day and came back with an empty wagon and a short report on which families had the greatest need, and Clara adjusted accordingly. Not everyone in Willowbend had been kind to her in the 7 months she had been coming to the Saturday market. There were people who had been indifferent and a few who had been something less than indifferent. The particular cool assessment of a small community evaluating an outsider and finding the evaluation not entirely favorable. She knew who they were. She baked for them anyway. She baked for them with the same care she brought to the families she liked, the same quality of flour, the same attention to the crust and the crumb and the temperature, because the quality of the work was not contingent on the worthiness of the recipient and never had been. This was the difference she understood between the Clara who had baked in the dark in Millhaven to justify her existence and the Clara who was baking now. The baking had always been an act of love, but before the love had been a plea. It had been, "I will give you something beautiful, please. In return, acknowledge that I have the right to be here." Now it was simply love extended outward without condition, because she had enough of it inside her, enough that had been given back to her to give without requiring anything in return. Some people thanked her. Some did not. Old Ray Calloway, whose steel plow had broken Tom's hardpan the previous autumn, shook her hand with both of his and could not speak. Mrs. Hendricks from the dry goods store, who had never once acknowledged Clara at the Saturday market, despite buying bread from her table. For 4 months took a loaf and looked at Clara and looked away and said very quietly, "I appreciate it." And Clara said, "Of course," and meant it without any edge of satisfaction at the grudging quality of the acknowledgment, because she did not need the acknowledgment, which was the point. Tom's brother arrived on the 3rd day. He came on foot, which meant the road from his lowland property had been impassable by vehicle, which meant his property had been hit significantly harder than Tom's ridge-adjacent land. Daniel Brannigan was younger than Tom by 4 years, and had Tom's height, but none of his stillness, a man whose face showed everything it was thinking, and who had, by the evidence of the past 2 years, thought primarily about what he could acquire and how to acquire it. He looked diminished by the flood, muddied and tired, and when he found Tom at the edge of the property, he stood with his hands at his sides and said, "Tom, I need help." Tom looked at his brother for a long time. Clara was at the oven and could see them through the bakery's open doorway, and she did not move or speak. "Everything," Tom said. "The water took the barn. The house is standing, but the ground floor is gone. I lost 2 of the horses." Daniel's voice was flat in the way of someone who has already done the grieving and is now simply in the facts. "I don't have anywhere to go." Tom was quiet for another long moment. He looked at his brother with the gray-green eyes that were capable of considerable severity when called upon. He looked at him steadily, and without any of the anger that Clara knew was underneath the anger of a man who had his family's land taken from him by the person standing in front of him, and he kept whatever that anger was doing in its proper place while he thought. "I'm going to give you half of what I have in the reserve stores," Tom said. "Enough for 2 weeks if you're careful. And there's a man in town, Hargrove, who has a room above his cooperage that he'll rent at a fair rate to someone willing to help with the work. I'll write you a word of introduction." He paused. "That's what I have to offer." Daniel looked at him. Something moved across his face, some complex calculation of pride and necessity winning. "And after 2 weeks," he said. "After 2 weeks, you'll have found your own way forward," Tom said, "which you are entirely capable of doing. You always were." Another pause, shorter this time. "I forgive you, Daniel. I want you to know that because carrying unforgiveness is a weight I'm not interested in carrying. But forgiveness is not the same as trust, and trust is not something that gets rebuilt in a conversation. My family is standing in that bakery right there, and everything I have goes to her and to this land first and last." Daniel looked toward the bakery. Clara met his eyes through the doorway without hostility and without welcome, simply with the clear, direct gaze of a woman who knows exactly where she stands and does not require anyone's permission to stand there. He looked away first. "All right," he said. Tom went inside and put together the reserve stores, half of them measured out with scrupulous accuracy, and he wrote the note for Hargrove, and he walked Daniel to the road, and they said goodbye in the way of two people who share blood and a history and the specific indelible damage of a serious betrayal with a kind of complicated quietness that was neither warm nor hostile, but was honest, which was the best available outcome. Tom came back to the bakery and stood in the doorway. "All right," Clara said. She was sliding the next batch of loaves into the oven. "All right," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was nothing more that needed to be said about Daniel, not then, and not ever, really, because Tom had said what needed saying and done what needed doing, and kept the thing that mattered safe, which was the function of the kind of man he was. The bakery wall was rebuilt within the month. The building on Main Street resumed its construction in September, the flood having damaged the framing but not the foundation, which Tom had poured deep and true, and it was finished before the first frost. Clara painted the sign herself, clean black letters on a cream background, Clara's Sunrise, because that was what the mornings at Willow Bend had given her, that quality of light, coming all at once over the flat land, turning the dark to real, turning everything that had been obscured by night into its actual unhidden self. She opened the bakery on a Saturday in October one year, and 2 weeks after she had hauled flour sacks through the back alley of a general store in Millhaven in the dead of night so that no one would have to look at her. She opened the front door herself in a new dress the color of the autumn light on the prairie grass. A warm amber brown that she had made with the same honest attention she brought to everything, and she stood at the front counter of her own establishment on Willow Bend's Main Street, and she greeted the first customer of the day with a smile that required no performance, because it was simply the accurate expression of how she felt. The town came. Not all of it at once, not all of it with equal enthusiasm, but it came because the bread was extraordinary, and word of extraordinary things travels without assistance. By noon the first day she had sold through everything she had baked, which was a significant quantity, and she had a list of names for standing orders that filled the back of a full sheet of paper. The seasons turned again. Winter came and went, and the second spring's wheat was better than the first. The Saturday market became a Saturday ritual, but now Clara went to it as a vendor, supplementing the bakery rather than as her sole commercial enterprise, and she went easily without the old freight of anxiety because the market was not her justification for existing, it was simply something she did on Saturdays because she enjoyed it. She and Tom had been married quietly at the county courthouse in December in the practical, unornamented way of two people who had already been living as a family for months and were simply making the paperwork match the reality. There had been no ceremony and no guests and no fanfare, only the two of them, and the clerk and the cold December light through the courthouse windows. And Tom had looked at her when the clerk was finished and said, "Well?" And she had said yes, and they had driven home to Willowbend in the wagon with Bertie and McCready making their solid, unimpressed way through the cold, and it had been exactly right. By the following October, when the second harvest was in, and the bakery had established itself as something genuinely indispensable to the town's daily life, Clara was expecting their first child. She had told Tom on a Sunday evening, sitting on the front step with the cider and the enormous sky full of stars, and he had been very still for a moment, and then he had put his arm around her and pulled her close and rested his chin on the top of her head, and the quality of his stillness then was not his thinking. Quietly stillness or his being composed stillness, but a different kind entirely, the stillness of someone who has received something so good that moving feels like a risk. "Are you happy?" she asked him. "Clara," he said. The way he said her name with everything in it that he had always been more fluent at showing than at saying. "I have been building toward this my whole life without knowing what it was I was building toward." She looked out at the prairie dark at the stars that went all the way to the horizon, without apology at the lights of Willowbend, a mile and a half away, where her bakery sat on the corner of Main Street, with its sign painted in honest black letters. She thought about the back alley, and the flour sacks, and the cracked mirror. She thought about Vivian walking out the door with her 2 leather suitcases. She thought about the voice that had told her for 29 years that she was too much, that she took up too much space, that the only currency she had was her utility, and that even that was insufficient. She listened for that voice in the vast, quiet, star-filled night, and what she heard instead was the sound of the prairie, and Tom's heartbeat under her ear, and the absolute uncomplicated truth of where she was and who she was and what she had built from the ruins of what she had been given. She pressed her hand flat against her middle, where new life was just beginning its own long argument with the world. "Good," she said softly, "because so have I."